So where do you go for facts? I've been asking this question for years and obsessed with it. And actually, it started when I was a teenager. My dad had this really interesting policy. We couldn't eat dinner unless we came to the table with a fact. Okay, that was challenging, right? So I had an encyclopedia. I knew how to do this. I came to the table, and I had a fact. The capital of Bolivia is La Paz. That worked. Well, after a few days, my dad was like, you know what, Danny, I'm seeing a pattern here. I know all of the capitals of South American countries. Be creative. Do something unique. I went, all right, I got this covered. So the next night I came back and I got this one. Miles Davis is the greatest trumpet player that ever lived. I was so proud of that. And my dad had this funny look on his face. And he went, Danny, that is not a fact. That's an opinion. You're getting facts and opinions confused. No, but Dad, it's like, it's on the album. And he's like, no dinner for you. And you know, like most 15-year-olds, I was quite mature, I thought. And I dealt with this in a mature way. I said, I hate you! And I went to my room. Okay, well, many, many years later, it looks like Dad was right. And his inspiration made me go into becoming a college professor and teaching about facts, doing research on critical thinking. And we do have a problem. We're getting facts and opinions confused. So let's start with some clarity. What is a fact? A fact is a statement of information that is empirical, which means observable, objective, and measurable. This shirt is blue. That is a fact. Not to be confused with an opinion, which is none of those. This shirt is awesome. This shirt is amazing. You can't do that here. And then the worst possibility, the fake facts, misinformation. This shirt gives me superpowers. Ow. No, it doesn't. So what are we going to do? And how are we going to get some clarity about facts? Well, I decided to do some research looking at how people think about facts and what they do and how can they discriminate between what's a fact and what's not a fact. And we gave our subjects questions and actually statements and we asked them to analyze them. I'm going to give you an example of what we did with our subjects. I'm going to give you two statements. One of the statements is true and one of the statements is not true. Okay? Raise your hand if you think this is true. All bats are blind. Come on, some of you got to raise your hand. Come on, play with me here, even if you don't believe it. All right, the next one. We only use 10% of our brain. Yeah, there's some hands. I see some hands. You don't see them, but yeah, there's plenty of hands out there. Well, all right, I lied. Both of these facts were not true. But, you know, and not knowing that is not going to change your life. But what was interesting is how you began to think about this and where you stored this and where this all comes from. So what we did with our subjects, we had subjects and we gave them 10 statements. And we told them, 5 of the statements we told them were true and 5 of the statements were not true. And just like you, we lied. None of the statements were true. We also asked them to rate their confidence, how confident they were in their facts. Now, the other thing we did with our subjects, we divided them into groups of 5 or an individual. And that seemed to be interesting because, number one, the subjects in the groups of 5 tended to be a lot more confident in their fact than the individuals. And the other thing that happened was when we told them that none of the facts were true, the subjects in the groups were like, you know, I knew that wasn't true. I really did, but everybody in my group was so confident. I just decided, yeah, that's probably what it was. What was happening here is a type of something we call in psychology confirmation bias. Confirmation bias happens when you have a belief and you look for support and information that supports your belief. For example, if you think vitamin C can cure your cold, well, you're going to look for information that supports that belief. And our subjects fell into that category. What was happening here with our subjects, it was more important for them to agree with the other subjects than it was for the validity or the objectivity or the measurability of the fact. Agreement was driving their decision. Social value was driving their decision. And now there's a whole bunch of emerging research that seems to say, in neuroscience, that our brain's involved in this. When we agree, our brain releases a neurotransmitter called dopamine. You may have heard of dopamine. You get a dopamine squirt whenever somebody gives you a hug. You get a dopamine squirt when your team wins. And you get a dopamine squirt when you agree with somebody. So now what is driving our understanding of facts are the social value of agreement and this biological imperative of dopamine squirts. And we like to agree. We're a country of agreeers. Yeah, there are some people who don't agree. They like become lawyers or vice principals. There was a vice principal yesterday who totally disagreed with that, so that made sense, actually. And confirmation bias is not just something that happens to adults. It happens when we're kids. I was talking to my grandson, who just turned 7, about Santa Claus. And I was saying, you know what, Liam? It takes us 4 hours to get to Grandma's house, right? Yeah. But you claim that Santa Claus can make it around the world in one night. How do you explain that? And he said, you know what, Pop? You know nothing about Santa Claus. You're old. He had a point. But he also had another thing about what he said led me to another barrier we have when it comes to facts. And that has to do with the credibility of the source. Granted, I am not a credible source when it comes to Santa Claus. I admitted that. But when it comes to facts, what are we going to do with all the sources we're getting? You know, back in the 70s, sorry, I'm old, as my grandson pointed out. Back in the 70s, we had 2 sources of information for news, claims, and facts. We had the newspaper, where we had editorial boards with integrity. Newspaper stories did not get published unless it was vetted. There was no such thing as fake news. And then we had television. We had Walter Cronkite. You may know Walter. The most trusted man in America. When Walter said it, everybody believed it was true. There was no confusion. We had confidence. Let's come to the present, and what do we have? Google, Twitter, Facebook, the blogosphere, Snapchat? Seriously? People are getting their news from sources that are not vetted, that are not curated. Do you know that Google has 3.5 billion hits a day, 40,000 searches a second? If you started tracking Google when I started talking, we'd be well over 1 million searches with no control. There's no organization that checks what's online. This is a problem. So what we've tried to do is come up with a way to at least get closer to the truth and to the facts and the information we get every day from the internet. The first thing we've thought about was something called inoculation. No, you don't have to get a shot, but we use it as a metaphor. Inoculation, you go to the doctor, it prevents the flu. Well, in social psychology, we use inoculation to describe what happens with persuasion. A lot of times in persuasion, you just get one-sided arguments. So researchers have found that if we force people to look at another perspective, get out of their comfort zone, it protects them against the dogma of the one-sided argument. I mean, think about Facebook. You're in this echo chamber where you're around people who agree with you, you're getting news stories that you agree with, you've got to get outside that zone and look for different perspectives, alternative explanations. It may not change your mind, but at least it gives you a start at looking at a sort of other perspective. Another thing, we are a nation of lazy clickers. We like to go to that first page of Google and stop there. And when we asked our subjects about that, they said, yeah, the first page, it must be true. It's on the first page. No, that's not true. When you go on a search for Google, on a Google search and looking at links, you need to go to the 3rd page, the 4th page, beyond those first pages. There's something called Google Scholar, which provides you with peer-reviewed articles that are done by people who've done research, and that you had a very, very good chance that that information has been vetted. And then there's another feature called verbatim. you may not know about. Verbatim is really cool because it filters out your search so that the only words, the words that you use in your search, take you to websites that have all those words and not some random words to take you to some random crazy website. All right, and the next, experts. What's going on with experts? I mean, over the last 2 years, there have actually been books written about this, that we don't rely on experts. We don't need experts. We got WebMD. Who needs to go to the doctor? Okay? You need experts. Experts have spent their whole career doing research in areas that we have no knowledge of. Experts are important. I mean, who do you want flying your planes, Sully? Or some guy who just got his license? Who do you want doing your surgery? An expert, right? Who do you want fixing your car? An expert. So why not, when you go online, check for the experts, so the source of the articles or the claims that are being made. It's there. And by the way, if you can't find a credible source associated with a claim or a fact online, that fact is not true. So assume that that expert knows what he's talking about. Give him a chance, or her a chance. Okay, so the next time you go online, I'm going to ask you to do 3 things. Inoculate. Don't be a lazy clicker. And trust experts. They know what they're talking about. They fill in the knowledge that you don't know. All right, well, I'm going to conclude with a quote. And I find this ironic because the quote has been associated with Mark Twain and Will Rogers. And fact-checking tells us that neither one of these guys said this. It's crazy, man. It was in a movie, and it had Mark Twain. It's like, nope, he didn't say it. Somebody said this. So here's something you can do when you do your Google search later. Find out who said this quote, because I think it does a great summary of what I've been trying to tell you. And here's the quote. It's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure, but ain't so. Thank you.